The day of my final interview, my mother blocked the front door. "Your brother has a brunch meeting with a very important partner," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You are staying home and watching his kids today." I stood there in my cheap thrift store suit, clutching a plastic folder that held my resume, and told her that this interview could change my entire life. My father, who was sitting in his recliner reading the morning paper, did not even look up when he laughed. "Girls like you do not get lives," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You get duties. Your brother is building a legacy for this family, and you are just being selfish." Right on cue, my older brother Cameron walked down the stairs reeking of an expensive cologne that I knew for a fact my parents had paid for by taking out a second mortgage on their house. He did not say a word to me. He simply dropped a heavy diaper bag right onto my freshly polished discount store shoes. "Make sure they eat organic," he sneered before walking past me toward the garage. I looked down at the diaper bag. I looked at my mother, who was already turning her back on me to go pour another cup of coffee. I looked at my father, who was completely absorbed in the sports section. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply stepped over the diaper bag, walked through the kitchen, pushed open the back door, and stepped out into the freezing autumn rain. I walked 2 miles to the bus stop, shivering in the cold. I went to the interview. I got the job, and I never went back to that house again. My name is Gemma. I am 33 years old, and today I am the Senior Mergers and Acquisitions Specialist for Summit Holdings, which is one of the most ruthless and successful investment firms in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk out into a storm to escape the people who were supposed to protect you. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Illinois, I was always the scapegoat. My parents, Richard and Patricia, poured every ounce of their financial and emotional resources into Cameron. He was the golden child, the handsome son who was destined for corporate greatness. Meanwhile, I was expected to fade into the background. I paid my own way through state college by working night shifts at a diner, while my parents bought Cameron a brand new sports car for merely passing his business classes. They constantly reminded me that my role was to support my brother. I was supposed to be the safety net, the built-in babysitter, the silent background character in the grand play of Cameron's life. But walking out that back door 10 years ago changed the trajectory of my entire existence. I clawed my way up the corporate ladder with a singular, relentless focus. I learned how to read financial statements like other people read novels. I learned how to spot corporate rot, how to identify failing management, and how to surgically remove toxic executives from failing companies. The heavy door of the Summit Holdings boardroom closed behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. The room was located on the 60th floor, overlooking the sprawling metallic grid of downtown Chicago. I walked toward the head of the long mahogany table, my custom-tailored charcoal suit projecting an aura of absolute authority. Sitting across from me was a man who until 20 minutes ago had believed he was untouchable. He was the billionaire chief executive officer of a national retail chain that our firm was in the process of acquiring. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a crumpled linen handkerchief. He had tried to hide his personal debts within the company pension fund, a classic move of a desperate man trying to maintain an illusion of wealth. I slid a thick, glossy folder across the polished wood surface. It stopped exactly 1 inch from his trembling hands. "Inside that folder is a complete forensic accounting of your offshore accounts," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. "It details the shell companies you used to bleed your own employees dry to fund your private jet leases and your real estate purchases in Aspen. You have 2 options today. You can sign the resignation papers, relinquish all of your stock options, and walk away with nothing but your freedom. Or I can slide this folder to the federal agents who are currently waiting in the lobby downstairs. The choice is entirely yours, but you have exactly 60 seconds to make it." The man stared at the documents, his face draining of all color. He tried to speak, to formulate some sort of defense or negotiation, but the cold, hard facts printed on the pages offered no escape. His hands shook as he picked up the pen and signed his name on the dotted line, surrendering his empire to my firm. As he was escorted out of the room by our security personnel, my assistant walked in, carrying 2 cups of black coffee and a fresh manila folder. She set the coffee down and handed me the file. "The acquisition team wants you to look at this one immediately," she said, tapping the cover. "The company is called Vanguard Media. They are a mid-sized communications conglomerate based right here in the city. They are begging for a $50 million bailout package to avoid filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Our analysts think there is potential for a highly profitable restructuring if we strip the company down to its core assets, but the executive board is a complete mess. They are burning through cash at an unprecedented rate, and no one can figure out exactly where the money is going." I took a sip of the dark bitter coffee and opened the dossier. I bypassed the optimistic executive summaries and the carefully curated marketing materials. I always preferred to look directly at the leadership roster. Companies rarely fail because of bad products, they fail because of bad people. I flipped to the page detailing the senior management team. My eyes scanned the names, the credentials, the compensation packages, and then my breath caught in my throat. Staring back at me from the glossy paper was a professional headshot of a man with a perfectly styled haircut and a smug, familiar smile. The title beneath the photograph read, "Vice President of Sales." The name printed in bold black letters was Cameron. It was my brother. The same man who had tossed a diaper bag at my feet 10 years ago, expecting me to sacrifice my future for his convenience, was now sitting at the top of a failing company, practically begging my firm to hand him $50 million to save his luxurious lifestyle. A cold electric thrill shot through my veins. The universe had a wicked sense of humor, and it had just handed me the ultimate opportunity for justice. I immediately scheduled a private meeting with the chief executive officer of Summit Holdings. He was a sharp, pragmatic man who trusted my instincts implicitly. When I sat down in his office, he told me that he wanted to dispatch our most aggressive audit team to Vanguard Media by the end of the week. He wanted them to turn the company upside down and shake out every hidden liability before we even considered committing a single dollar of bailout money. I shook my head firmly. "If you send a corporate audit team marching through their front doors, wearing expensive suits and carrying clipboards, you will only make the rats scatter," I told him. "They know they are bleeding cash. They know they are hiding something. If they see us coming, they will shred the documents, they will wipe the servers, and they will bury the evidence so deep we will never find it. I need to go in completely undercover." I proposed a different strategy. I told him I would enter Vanguard Media posing as a low-level independent financial evaluator, a temporary contractor hired by the bank to simply scan and organize their physical paper files. It was a role so insignificant that the arrogant executives at the top would never pay any attention to me. They would ignore me just like my family had always ignored me. My boss agreed to the plan, giving me complete autonomy to handle the acquisition. That night, I stayed late in my corner office long after the rest of the building had emptied out. The city below me was a sea of glittering lights, but my focus was entirely on the glowing monitors on my desk. Before I stepped foot inside Vanguard Media, I needed to know exactly what kind of monster I was hunting. I accessed our proprietary financial databases and pulled up the preliminary disclosures Vanguard had submitted with their bailout request. I bypassed the company-wide metrics and ran a deep-dive forensic credit check, specifically targeting the sales department. More specifically, I targeted Cameron. What I found over the next 4 hours was a masterclass in financial deception. Cameron was not just a terrible sales executive, he was a parasite. I traced a massive black hole of debt that had been cleverly disguised through a series of complex accounting maneuvers. Cameron had been cross-collateralizing company assets to secure high-interest personal loans. He was systematically forging vendor invoices and redirecting corporate funds to maintain a facade of extreme, unimaginable wealth. I pulled up the expense reports tied directly to his corporate credit card. The sheer audacity of the charges made my blood boil. His wife Ashley, a woman who had once mocked my thrift store clothes at a family dinner, had been charging hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Vanguard Media corporate expense account. There were receipts for custom designer handbags, luxury spa vacations to the Maldives private country club memberships, and even a complete remodel of their kitchen featuring imported Italian marble. They were bleeding the company completely dry, sucking the life out of a business that employed hundreds of hardworking people, all while demanding a $50 million bailout from my firm to cover their tracks. I printed out the bank statements and spread them across my desk. The staggering numbers painted a crystal clear picture of greed and entitlement. I thought about the years I had spent sleeping on a broken mattress, eating cheap noodles, and paying my own way through community college, while my parents funded Cameron's entire existence. I thought about how they had called me selfish for simply wanting a career of my own. Now here was the golden child, the pride and joy of the family, actively committing federal financial crimes to sustain a lifestyle he had never actually earned. He was trying to steal from my company to keep his house of cards from collapsing. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a heavy red marker. I looked at the executive roster one more time, staring at Cameron's smug face. I pressed the marker against the paper and drew a thick, decisive red line straight through his name. The hunt was officially on. I gathered the files, locked them in my briefcase, and prepared myself for Monday morning. I was going to walk right into his kingdom, not as his sister, but as his executioner, and he was not going to see it coming until the trap snapped entirely shut. Monday morning arrived with the sharp bite of wind coming off Lake Michigan. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the Vanguard Media building. I had deliberately left my custom-tailored suits and my diamond stud earrings back at my penthouse. Today I wore a plain beige trench coat over a generic navy shift dress. My hair was pulled back into a simple tight bun. I needed to look exactly like what they expected, an underpaid, invisible financial contractor hired simply to push papers around a dusty filing room. The lobby of Vanguard Media was an exercise in fading corporate vanity. The marble floors needed polishing, and the oversized digital display screens behind the reception desk flickered with outdated promotional campaigns. But what struck me most was the atmosphere. You can always smell a dying company. It smells like stale coffee and fear. Employees scurried past with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, clutching their briefcases like shields against the impending layoffs everyone knew were coming. I approached the reception desk to collect my temporary visitor badge. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, was frantically sorting through a stack of disorganized mail. Before I could even announce my name, the polished chrome doors of the executive elevator slid open with a soft chime. Out stepped my brother. Cameron had not changed in 10 years. If anything, his arrogance had simply expanded to fill the expensive Italian suit he was wearing. He was talking loudly into his latest model smartphone, barking orders at whoever had the misfortune of being on the other end of the line. He strode across the marble floor with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He stopped right at the reception desk, completely ignoring the exhausted receptionist, and snapped his fingers loudly. "Hey, you!" he barked, not even bothering to look at my face. "You are the new temp from the agency, right? Run down to the corner cafe. I need a large dark roast, 2 shots of espresso, no sugar, and make it fast. I have a room full of idiots to fire in 20 minutes. He shoved a crumpled $10 bill toward my chest. I stood there for a fraction of a second, simply absorbing the absolute absurdity of the moment. I was the senior mergers and acquisitions specialist for Summit Holdings. I had the power to liquidate his entire existence with a single phone call. And my brother, who had not bothered to look me in the eye since the day he threw a diaper bag at my feet, was handing me a $10 bill to fetch his coffee. I reached out and took the crumpled bill from his hand. "I will get right on that," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "Keep the change," he threw over his shoulder, already turning his back to me and walking toward the glass security gates. "Just do not burn the coffee. I hate burned coffee." I watched him walk away, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. I took the temporary visitor badge from the stunned receptionist, who offered me an apologetic look. I did not go to the corner cafe. I walked over to the break room on the ground floor, poured a cup of the cheap, bitter corporate coffee from the communal pot, and carried it toward the executive suites on the 5th floor. The 5th floor was a stark contrast to the rest of the building. Thick plush carpets, mahogany-paneled walls, and expensive modern art hung everywhere. It was a monument to the financial bleeding I had discovered in the database the night before. I walked down the long corridor toward the corner office that bore a gleaming brass plaque reading Cameron, Vice President of Sales. The heavy glass door was propped wide open. Inside, the scene was a masterclass in toxic management. Cameron was pacing back and forth behind his massive oak desk, his face flushed dark red with manufactured rage. Standing in a line before him were 3 junior account managers looking absolutely terrified. "I do not want to hear your pathetic excuses," Cameron shouted, slamming his hand down on a stack of quarterly reports. "You are missing your revenue targets by 30%. 30%. Do you understand how that makes me look to the board? Do you understand that we have the biggest investment firm in Chicago coming to bail our asses out and you 3 are making my department look like a charity case?" I stood quietly in the doorway holding the cheap paper cup of coffee. The hypocrisy was almost beautiful. He was screaming at these young employees for missing targets while he was actively siphoning millions of dollars into fake shell companies to pay for his wife's luxury vacations. He was blaming the crew for the sinking ship while he was the one actively drilling holes in the hull. "If you do not double your numbers by Friday, I am going to personally ensure you never work in this industry again," Cameron threatened, jabbing his finger at the youngest manager in the line. "Now get out of my office and start cold calling." The 3 account managers practically ran out of the room, keeping their heads bowed as they squeezed past me in the doorway. Cameron let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and loosened his expensive silk tie. He turned his back to the door, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city street below. "Put the coffee on the desk and empty the recycling bin on your way out," he ordered, assuming I was the temp he had accosted in the lobby. I stepped fully into the spacious office. My sensible, low-heeled shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. I walked directly over to his immaculate mahogany desk and set the paper cup down right on top of his quarterly revenue projections. The hot coffee immediately left a dark, wet ring on the vital documents. "I told you not to burn the coffee," Cameron snapped, whirling around to face me. He reached out to snatch the cup angrily, his eyes moving from the stained paper up to my face. His hand froze in mid-air. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as if he might pass out. His jaw went completely slack, and his eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated shock. The arrogant sneer he had worn just seconds ago vanished, completely replaced by a look of sheer terror. He stared at me, his brain clearly struggling to process the impossible reality standing in his office. "Hello, Cameron?" I said, my voice perfectly steady and dangerously calm. "It has been a long time. I kept the change just like you asked." He tried to speak, but only a strangled, rasping sound came from his throat. Before he could formulate a single coherent word, the heavy glass door swung wide open again. His wife Ashley marched into the office carrying a brand new designer shopping bag that cost more than a junior employee's yearly salary. She was dressed in an ostentatious silk blouse and excessive jewelry, clearly ready to play the role of the wealthy executive wife. "Are you done yelling at the peasants yet?" Ashley complained, dropping her expensive bag onto one of the leather guest chairs. She turned her nose up and glared at me, her eyes scanning my plain beige trench coat and simple hairstyle. "Why is the temp still standing here? You hired this country girl to stand around and look stupid. I swear your human resources department finds the most pathetic people." Cameron was still completely frozen, staring at me as if he had seen a ghost. Ashley rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest. "Seriously, Cameron, tell her to leave," Ashley demanded, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Your parents are arriving in 20 minutes to tour this new corner office of yours. I do not want some cheap temporary worker hovering around making the place look bad. Tell her to go scrub something." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply maintained eye contact with my brother, watching the cold sweat begin to form on his forehead. He knew exactly who I was, and the panic radiating from him was palpable. "I think your wife has a point, Cameron," I said softly, offering him a chilling smile. "I should probably get back to work. I have a lot of financial records to review in the basement archives. I will be handling the filing room today. Please make sure my brother makes himself comfortable while he waits for his guests." I turned gracefully and walked out of the corner office, leaving the tense silence behind me. I had exactly what I needed. They still viewed me as the worthless, subservient girl they could easily step on. They had no idea that the woman walking down to their basement archives was the exact same woman who held the financial execution orders for their entire company right in her briefcase. The archives room was located 3 floors down in a windowless concrete bunker. It was cold, damp, and filled with rows of metal filing cabinets containing years of Vanguard Media's physical contracts. I sat down at a small metal desk, opened my laptop, and connected a specialized decryption drive to the internal network port. Within seconds, I bypassed their outdated firewall and accessed the deeply buried financial ledgers. What I saw on the screen was far worse than the preliminary reports had suggested. Cameron was not just reckless, he was a criminal. I pulled up the hidden ledgers corresponding to the exact dates Ashley had taken her extravagant trips to Europe. I matched the fraudulent vendor payments directly to the offshore accounts I had identified the night before. $8 million. He had drained $8 million from a struggling media company to fund his wife's shopping addictions and his own grandiose ego. I pressed print, watching the physical evidence of his incoming prison sentence slide out of the machine. I stacked the papers, neatly securing them in my folder. I had the smoking gun. Now I just needed to wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. I slipped the freshly printed ledgers into the hidden compartment of my leather briefcase, snapping the solid brass locks shut. The crisp sheets of paper sitting in the dark interior were the exact equivalent of a corporate death warrant. I took a slow, steady breath, letting the cold, damp air of the underground archive room clear my mind. I needed to maintain my cover for just a little while longer to ensure the trap was fully set. I grabbed a thick stack of meaningless, outdated expense reports from a nearby metal table, cradling them against my chest to complete the illusion of a subservient filing clerk. I walked over to the heavy steel door and pushed it open, stepping out into the fluorescent-lit hallway. The elevator ride back up to the main lobby was quiet, giving me time to lock away the apex predator and bring the invisible sister back to the surface. When the silver doors parted, I stepped out onto the polished marble floor of the reception area. Cameron was standing near the front desk, his posture rigid. He had clearly spent the last 20 minutes pacing the floor and convincing himself that his initial panic up in his office was entirely unwarranted. His ego was a fragile, bloated thing, and it had already constructed a comfortable lie to explain my presence in his building. In his mind, I was not a threat. I was a failure. I was the rebellious sister who had walked out into the freezing rain 10 years ago, only to fail miserably and come crawling back to the family for scraps. He spotted me walking toward the mailroom and immediately marched over, deliberately blocking my path. He had completely regained his arrogant swagger. He shot his cuffs, revealing a massive gold Rolex watch that caught the bright lobby lights. I knew exactly how he had paid for that watch, and it was certainly not with his executive salary. "Well, look who finally decided to rejoin the real world," he said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. He stepped closer, forcing me to stop and look up at him. "I have to admit, Gemma, I am actually surprised. 10 years of running away, playing the misunderstood rebel, and you finally drag yourself to your brother's company to beg for a temporary filing job. Did the diner fire you? Did you finally realize that walking out on this family meant you would amount to absolutely nothing?" I stood perfectly still, holding the stack of worthless papers against my chest. I let him talk, let him dig the hole deeper with every arrogant syllable. "You should be thanking me on your knees," he continued, gesturing expansively around the lavish marble lobby. "I built this empire. I am the vice president of sales. I am the one bringing in a $50 million bailout from Summit Holdings to take this company global. And you are carrying my trash. I hope you understand the supreme irony here. Mom and Dad were right about you all those years ago. You really do not have a life. You just have duties to serve your betters. Before I could offer a response, the sharp clicking of designer heels echoed across the marble floor. Ashley strutted over to us, swinging a brand new Dior handbag that still had the protective plastic clinging to the gold hardware. She positioned herself next to Cameron, slipping her arm intimately through his and looking at me as if I were a toxic stain on the pristine floor. "Why are you still talking to the help, Cameron?" she complained, her voice a high-pitched whine that grated against the ears. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain beige trench coat and my tightly pulled back hair. "You hired this country bumpkin out of pity, did you not? I told you that was a massive mistake. She does not even know how to dress for a corporate environment. She looks like she crawled out of a dumpster." She tightened her grip on Cameron's arm and leaned closer to him, speaking loudly enough for me to hear every single word. "Your parents are going to be here any minute to tour your new executive office," Ashley reminded him, shooting me a venomous glare. "They are so proud of everything you have achieved. Do not let her ruin this monumental day for us. If she is wandering around the lobby looking like a homeless person when your parents walk through those doors, it will embarrass all of us. Tell her to go hide in a supply closet somewhere until they leave." The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She was standing there holding a handbag purchased with stolen corporate funds, demanding that I hide so I would not ruin their carefully curated aesthetic. I felt the familiar urge to tear them apart right then and there, to pop open the locks of my briefcase, pull out the bank statements, and watch their perfect lives shatter into a million pieces. But a top-tier mergers and acquisitions specialist never plays her hand prematurely. The trap needed to be set in front of a proper audience. I looked at Cameron, noting the faint bead of nervous sweat forming right above his brow despite his arrogant posturing. The Rolex on his wrist was heavy, but the crushing financial debt he was drowning in was infinitely heavier. I offered them both a mild, chilling smile. "You are absolutely right," I said, my voice soft and deeply accommodating. "I will just take these documents down to the financial records room and stay entirely out of your way. I certainly would not want to ruin your big moment. You just go ahead and welcome Mom and Dad. Enjoy the family reunion while it lasts." Cameron smirked, clearly satisfied that he had successfully put me back in my proper place. "Good," he snapped, adjusting his designer tie. "Stay in the basement until your shift is completely over, and do not even think about expecting me to introduce you to my investors at the banquet tonight." I nodded politely and took a slow, deliberate step back. But just as I turned toward the long hallway, the heavy glass revolving doors of the main entrance began to spin. A valet in a crisp red uniform held the door steady as two familiar figures stepped out of the biting Chicago cold and into the warm lobby. Richard and Patricia had arrived. My mother was wearing a stiff, expensive tweed suit, looking around the corporate lobby with an expression of intense greed and swelling pride. My father walked right beside her, carrying himself with an unearned sense of absolute superiority. They spotted Cameron and Ashley immediately, their faces breaking into massive, triumphant smiles. They opened their arms wide to embrace their golden child, the son who had supposedly conquered the corporate world and secured their retirement. And then my mother's eyes shifted past Cameron's shoulder. Her gaze bypassed the luxury decor and landed directly on me. The triumphant smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated disgust. The family reunion had officially begun, and the stage was perfectly set for the slaughter. Patricia did not even hesitate. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, the sheer joy of seeing her successful son evaporated entirely. Her face hardened into a mask of pure resentment. She abandoned Cameron and Ashley mid-embrace and marched directly toward me. Her heavy footsteps echoed sharply across the quiet lobby. I was standing near a small glass decorative table, resting my stack of archival folders against its polished surface. I did not move. I simply watched the woman who had given birth to me cross the distance with fury radiating from every pore. When she reached me, she did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I had been for the past decade. She raised her hand and violently slapped the stack of folders right off the glass table. The heavy files hit the marble floor with a loud crack. Dozens of papers spilled out, sliding across the pristine tiles in a chaotic mess. The receptionist gasped from her desk, but a single sharp glare from Patricia silenced her instantly. "You ungrateful wretch!" Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured rage. She pointed a manicured finger right at my face. "You vanish for 10 years without a single word. You walk out on this family and leave your aging parents to shoulder a massive bank loan for your brother. And now what? Now you finally run out of money and crawl back here to eat off his plate. You come to his company to leech off his success." I looked down at the scattered papers near my sensible shoes. I felt absolutely nothing. No heartbreak, no sadness, just the cold, mechanical precision of a woman observing a predictable algorithm. I slowly bent at the knees, keeping my spine perfectly straight, and began gathering the fallen documents. I stacked them neatly, tapping the edges against the marble floor before standing back up. I looked directly into my mother's angry eyes. "Shoulder a bank loan for him?" I asked, my voice entirely smooth and devoid of any defensive emotion. "That is strange. I heard his executive salary is $500,000 a year. With his quarterly bonuses, he should be pulling in close to $1 million. Why exactly are his retired parents paying off his debts?" The question hung in the air, heavy and razor-sharp. Patricia blinked, taken aback by my absolute lack of intimidation. For 10 years, she had built a narrative in her head where I was a destitute failure who would eventually return broken and weeping. Meeting a calm, analytical wall completely derailed her script. Before she could formulate a response, my father, Richard, stepped forward. He positioned himself protectively in front of Cameron, puffing out his chest as if he were defending a helpless victim. "You know absolutely nothing about the corporate world, Gemma." Richard barked, his face flushing a deep shade of red. "Your brother had to build his empire from the ground up. He needed seed capital to secure his position here at Vanguard Media. Family makes sacrifices for the successful ones. We took out a second mortgage on our house to guarantee his shares because we knew he was a winner. We believed in him. Something you clearly never understood." I looked past my father and locked eyes with Cameron. He was standing there in his bespoke Italian suit, wearing a gold Rolex that cost more than my parents' vehicles combined. He was letting his elderly parents believe they had to sacrifice their financial security so he could succeed. He had taken their retirement money to buy his initial stake in the company, and then proceeded to embezzle millions of dollars to fund Ashley's luxury lifestyle. He had not paid them back a single cent. He was letting them drown while he drank vintage champagne on yachts in the Mediterranean. "Business requires significant overhead," Ashley chimed in, stepping up beside my mother and crossing her arms defensively. She shot me a look of absolute superiority. Not that a filing clerk would understand high-level financial strategy. Cameron has a massive department to run. He has client dinners, networking events, and investor retreats to fund. "Your parents were smart enough to invest in a sure thing." "I see," I replied, nodding slowly, as if I were genuinely absorbing their pathetic excuses. "So you took out a second mortgage to fund his business expenses. That is incredibly generous of you. I suppose all those trips to Paris and the new summer house in the Hamptons were strictly for client networking as well." Cameron went perfectly rigid. The color completely drained from his face for the second time that morning. His eyes darted nervously toward his parents and then back to me. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "What are you talking about?" Patricia demanded, turning to look at her golden child with a flicker of confusion. "Cameron, you said you were renting a small cabin in upstate New York for the summer. You never mentioned a house in the Hamptons." Cameron let out a forced, hollow laugh, quickly wrapping his arm around his mother's shoulders. "She is delusional, Mom," he lied, his voice pitching slightly higher than normal. "She is just spouting nonsense to make herself sound important. You know how jealous she has always been of me? She probably read some trashy magazine and is projecting her fantasies onto us. Come on, let us go upstairs to my office. We do not need to stand here and listen to the hired help spinning fairy tales." He tried to steer them toward the executive elevators, but I took a deliberate step forward, blocking their path just slightly. I held the stack of papers against my chest, feeling the hard edge of my briefcase resting against my leg. The briefcase containing the exact wire transfer logs that proved every single word I had just said. Jealousy is a fascinating concept, I noted, my voice carrying easily across the quiet lobby. I am sure Cameron will explain his brilliant financial strategies to you during your tour. He has been moving a lot of money around lately. Very complex acquisitions, very specific offshore accounts. Shut your mouth! Cameron snapped, his facade cracking. The fear in his eyes was vivid and raw. You are a temporary worker, Gemma. Do not push your luck or I will have security throw you out into the street right now. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp thing that made my father take a half step back. I am just heading down to the basement, Cameron, I said politely, stepping aside and gesturing toward the elevators. Enjoy your family reunion. I am sure you have a lot of numbers to discuss before the Summit Holdings representatives arrive this afternoon. They are known to be quite thorough with their audits. I turned my back on them and walked away without waiting for a response. I could feel their eyes burning into my spine as I headed toward the service corridor. Patricia was probably already whispering more insults about my clothes and my attitude, but I did not care. I had just planted a massive ticking time bomb right in the middle of their perfect family dynamic. Cameron knew that I knew. He knew I had the pieces of the puzzle, and now he was going to spend the next few hours sweating through his expensive suit, wondering exactly how much damage I could do. He thought he could rely on our parents' blind faith to protect him. He thought his superficial charm and fake wealth made him untouchable. He had no idea that the real Summit Holdings representative was not arriving this afternoon. She was already inside his building, walking down to his basement and preparing to burn his entire empire to the ground. I had barely taken 3 steps toward the dim service corridor when my father's voice cracked like a heavy whip across the polished marble lobby. He was not about to let me walk away and have the last word. Not in front of his golden boy, not in the building he believed his son ruled. Turn around when I am speaking to you, Gemma. Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the high glass ceilings. I stopped. The heavy silence of the Vanguard media reception area rushed back in, amplifying the sheer hostility radiating from my family. I took a slow, stabilizing breath and pivoted on my sensible, low-heeled shoes to face them again. My father marched forward, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. He stopped just inches from my face, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my chest. You have absolutely no concept of how high-level corporate business operates, he spat, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. You stand there and judge your brother's salary. You judge his expenses. His salary is strictly for corporate networking. Do you think multi-million-dollar deals are forged in dusty basements by filing clerks like you? They are made on elite golf courses and at exclusive charity galas. Cameron has to project an image of absolute success to attract success. It is an investment. He paused, drawing a ragged breath, as if simply looking at me drained his energy. He puffed out his chest, his eyes burning with a blinding toxic pride. Your mother and I happily put our retirement home on the line for him. Richard continued, his voice rising in volume so the receptionist could hear every word. We signed the second mortgage papers without a single hesitation because Cameron is building a generational legacy. He needed that seed capital to secure his executive partnership here. He is carrying the entire future of this family on his back, while you are doing what exactly? Pushing a mail cart. You vanished for 10 years, left us to shoulder the financial burden, and now you crawl back to eat the crumbs off his table. I stood perfectly still, the heavy manila folder resting securely inside my briefcase, burning like a radioactive core. The sheer profound tragedy of his delusion was almost suffocating. My parents had mortgaged their only asset, their lifelong sanctuary, to fund Cameron's fabricated empire. And Cameron stood right there behind them, wearing a smug expression, letting his elderly parents boast about a financial sacrifice he had already squandered. He had not used their mortgage money to secure his position. He had funneled it directly into his offshore shell companies to pay for Ashley's designer wardrobes and their summer estate in the Hamptons. They were drowning in debt for a son who viewed them as nothing more than a convenient ATM. "You are taking up valuable oxygen in this lobby," Richard snarled, his upper lip curling into a sneer of pure disgust. The Summit Holdings delegation is arriving in less than 2 hours to finalize a $50 million capital injection. I will not have my son's defining corporate victory jeopardized by a bitter, estranged daughter standing around looking like a vagrant. Get out of my sight. Go find a mop and clean the executive restrooms. At least try to make yourself useful to your brother for once in your miserable life. Before I could formulate a response that would not prematurely detonate my cover, Cameron stepped out from behind our father. He held up his hands, palms facing outward, playing the role of the benevolent and patient ruler, calming his loyal subjects. "Dad, relax," Cameron said, his voice dripping with artificial magnanimity. "There is no need to get your blood pressure up. Let me handle this." He stepped toward me, projecting an aura of overwhelming superiority. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew a sleek black leather checkbook. It was the ultimate weapon of the deeply insecure man. He clicked a silver pen and began writing across the paper, resting the checkbook on his forearm. The scratching sound of the ink filled the tense air. He tore the slip of paper free and extended it toward me, holding it loosely between his index and middle finger. "Look," Gemma Cameron said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Despite the fact that you abandoned us 10 years ago, I am a forgiving guy. I genuinely believe in giving people second chances, even those who have spectacularly failed at life." He shook the check, slightly urging me to take it. "This is a check for $500, he continued, his voice carrying the sickening cadence of a savior bestowing a miracle upon a beggar. "Take it. Go down the street to a department store and buy yourself some clothes that do not smell like a thrift shop. Then come back here and make sure the main lobby and my boardroom are absolutely spotless. If the Summit executives are impressed today and we close this capital injection deal, I will personally speak to Human Resources on your behalf. I will get you a permanent position on the janitorial staff, full medical benefits, and a dental plan. It is vastly more than you deserve, but family takes care of family, right?" Behind him, Ashley let out a sharp, cruel snicker. Patricia nodded in solemn approval, her eyes glistening with pride at her son's supposed generosity. Richard crossed his arms, looking at me as if waiting for me to fall to my knees in tearful gratitude. I looked at the check fluttering slightly in his outstretched hand. $500. A pathetic performative bribe meant to establish his absolute dominance and humiliate me into total submission. I reached out slowly and took the crisp slip of paper from his fingers. Cameron's smug smile widened into a full-blown grin of victory. He thought he had won. He truly believed that poverty and desperation had finally broken my spirit, forcing me to swallow my pride and accept my designated role beneath his heel. I held the check up to the light, studying the messy, sprawling signature at the bottom right corner. It was the exact same arrogant signature I had just spent the last hour matching to dozens of fraudulent offshore wire transfers in the basement archives. I did not break eye contact with my brother as my thumbs gripped the top edge of the paper and my index fingers braced the bottom. With one swift, deliberate, and violently precise motion, I tore the check straight down the middle. The sharp ripping sound cut through the silent lobby like a gunshot. Cameron's victorious grin froze instantly. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearl necklace. Richard uncrossed his arms, his jaw dropping in absolute shock. I placed the torn halves over each other and ripped them again, reducing his arrogant bribe to worthless confetti. I opened my hands and let the pieces flutter down to the polished marble floor, watching them land perfectly across the toes of his expensive Italian leather shoes. "Thank you for the incredibly generous offer, Cameron," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that commanded the entire room. "But you can keep your money. I am afraid the Summit Holdings delegation will not be signing that garbage contract today." The sharp ripping sound seemed to echo off the high marble ceilings for an eternity. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The shredded pieces of Cameron's $500 bribe drifted down like snow, resting perfectly across the polished toe of his custom Italian leather shoes. Then the absolute silence shattered. Are you out of your miserable mind? Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing through the corporate lobby. Her hands trembled violently as she pointed a manicured finger at my face. Your brother offers you charity. He offers you a lifeline out of the gutter you crawled from, and you spit in his face. You are a disgrace to this family, Gemma. You always have been. Richard stepped forward, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He looked as though he wanted to physically strike me right there in front of the reception desk. You ungrateful little brat, Richard bellowed, drawing the attention of several employees waiting by the elevators. We should have known better than to let you step foot in this building. You are nothing but a jealous, toxic failure trying to ruin your brother's monumental day. You will never amount to anything. Cameron finally shook off his shock. The fake benevolent mask he had worn just moments ago melted away completely, leaving behind a sneer of pure, unadulterated malice. His ego had been bruised, and his reaction was instantaneous and vicious. He turned his head and snapped his fingers at the terrified receptionist behind the front desk. Call security right now, Cameron ordered, his voice carrying the harsh authority of a tyrant. I want this vagrant removed from the premises immediately. Tell them to drag her out by her hair if they have to. She is trespassing on private corporate property. Ashley crossed her arms, shivering in her expensive silk blouse, as if my very presence was a contagious disease. This is exactly what I told you, Cameron, she whined, stepping closer to him. She is completely psychotic. Get her out of here before the Summit Holdings representatives arrive. She is making the entire lobby smell like a cheap thrift store. Two large security guards in dark gray uniforms emerged from the hallway near the elevators. They moved quickly across the marble floor, their hands resting on their utility belts, responding to the frantic gestures of the receptionist. Cameron watched them approach, a smug, victorious grin returning to his flushed face. He truly believed he had won. He believed he was the untouchable king of Vanguard Media, and I was just a peasant being banished from his castle. I stood my ground. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply held my leather briefcase tightly against my side, feeling the solid weight of his financial execution orders secured within. Just as the lead security guard reached out to grab my shoulder, a sharp buzzing sound cut through the tense atmosphere. Cameron's sleek smartphone was vibrating violently in his breast pocket. The custom ringtone indicated it was his private executive line. He held up a hand, signaling the security guards to pause. He pulled the phone out, checking the caller identification. His posture immediately shifted from a raging bully to a polished corporate executive. He cleared his throat, smoothed his expensive tie, and answered the call. This is Cameron, he said, his voice dripping with artificial professionalism. Yes, speaking. I watched his face closely. The anger faded rapidly, replaced by a look of mounting excitement and unchecked greed. His eyes widened slightly, and he began to nod enthusiastically. Yes, absolutely, he said into the receiver, his voice trembling with sheer joy. Yes, I am completely available this evening. A private negotiation banquet. That sounds perfect. I look forward to discussing the final capital injection details with the lead representative. Thank you for the invitation. I will see you tonight. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He was practically vibrating with triumph. He turned to his parents and his wife, his chest puffed out so far he looked ridiculous. He completely ignored me for a moment, eager to bask in his own manufactured glory. That was my executive assistant, Cameron, announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried across the lobby. The lead acquisition director from Summit Holdings just personally requested my presence at a private negotiation dinner tonight. They want to finalize the $50 million buyout before tomorrow's board meeting. They love my projections. The deal is practically guaranteed. Patricia gasped, pressing her hands to her cheeks. Oh, Cameron, I am so incredibly proud of you. I knew you were destined for greatness. Richard clapped his son hard on the shoulder, a wide, triumphant smile breaking across his red face. You showed them, son. You built this empire, and now the billionaires are begging to sit at your table. Ashley leaned in and kissed his cheek, shooting me a look of absolute supreme victory. We are going to celebrate tonight, darling, she purred. We are going global. Cameron turned his smug gaze back to me. He gestured casually to the waiting security guards. "Throw her out," Cameron commanded, his voice dripping with arrogant pity. "Throw her out onto the street where she belongs. You see, Gemma, this is the difference between us. While you are sleeping in a gutter tonight crying over a torn check, I will be dining with the billionaires from Summit Holdings. I am about to become a corporate legend. You are literally nothing." The security guards stepped forward again, but I raised my hand. The simple, authoritative gesture made them hesitate. I took one slow, deliberate step toward my brother. He stood his ground, a mocking smile plastered across his face. I leaned forward, closing the distance until I was mere inches from his face. I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint, bitter scent of his nervous sweat. The sweat of a man who was secretly drowning in debt and praying for a miracle. I kept my voice incredibly low, a sharp, icy whisper meant only for his ears. "Make sure you wear your absolute most expensive suit tonight, Cameron," I whispered, my tone devoid of any human warmth. "You are going to need it to keep your last shred of dignity." I pulled back and offered him a final chilling smile. I did not wait for his reaction. I did not look at my screaming mother or my glaring father or his pathetic materialistic wife. I turned gracefully on my low-heeled shoes and walked straight toward the heavy glass revolving doors. The security guards parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to pass without a single word. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind. I hailed a passing taxi and slid into the back seat, placing my briefcase securely on my lap. The family reunion was officially over. Now it was time to prepare for dinner. The taxi ride back to my downtown penthouse suite was a necessary transition. As the city blurred past the rain-streaked windows, I mentally shed the pathetic disguise of the forgotten sister. The docile filing clerk with her sensible shoes and canvas tote bag no longer existed. She had served her purpose perfectly. She had infiltrated the rotting core of Vanguard Media, bypassed their laughable security protocols, and extracted the exact financial records required to execute a corporate slaughter. Now it was time to step into my actual life. I spent the next several hours preparing for the evening with the meticulous precision of a general dressing for battle. The grand ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria was not a place for subtlety. It was a glittering arena where fortunes were made and destroyed over cocktails and caviar. If my family wanted to play the game of high society optics, I was going to show them how the board was truly controlled. I stepped into a custom emerald green Alexander McQueen evening gown. The heavy silk draped perfectly over my frame, featuring sharp architectural lines that projected absolute authority. I fastened a vintage Cartier diamond collar around my neck, letting the cold, heavy stones rest against my skin. I secured matching diamond drops to my ears and slipped my feet into stiletto heels that echoed with a dangerous, sharp rhythm against the hardwood floor of my penthouse. When my private car pulled up to the gilded entrance of the hotel, the valet rushed forward to open the door. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, ignoring the flashing cameras of the local society press gathered by the velvet ropes. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of orchestrated excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, nearly drowned out by the hum of clinking champagne flutes and the arrogant laughter of Chicago's corporate elite. Waiters glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of truffle canapés and vintage Dom Perignon. It was an environment designed to intimidate the weak and elevate the powerful. It took me less than 30 seconds to locate my targets. They had positioned themselves near the center of the room, desperately orbiting the main ice sculpture, as if proximity to the centerpiece equated to social importance. Cameron was wearing the exact suit I had mocked earlier that morning. A dark, navy Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than his employees earned in a year. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, projecting the manic energy of a man who believed he had already won the lottery. Ashley stood plastered to his side wearing a gaudy sequin dress that screamed new money and desperation. Patricia and Richard hovered just over Cameron's shoulder, soaking up the reflected glory of their golden boy. My mother was clutching a glass of white wine, her neck adorned with a pearl necklace she had undoubtedly purchased on credit. My father stood with his chest puffed out aggressively, nodding at whatever Cameron was saying. They looked completely intoxicated by the illusion of their own success. I remained near the arched entrance, hidden in the shadows of a massive floral arrangement, observing them like a hawk tracking a nest of field mice. Cameron was holding court with a circle of venture capitalists and minor industry players. He was speaking loudly, ensuring his voice carried over the jazz music. The $50 million capital injection is merely a formality at this point, Cameron boasted, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his scotch. Summit Holdings recognizes a visionary media structure when they see one. I have built Vanguard Media from the ground up to dominate the digital landscape. The executives are practically begging to get a piece of our projected revenue. We are going to finalize the paperwork tonight, and by tomorrow morning, Vanguard will be expanding globally. One of the older investors raised an eyebrow, swirling the ice in his glass. $50 million is a massive risk in this current economic climate, Cameron. Summit Holdings is known for being utterly ruthless with their audits. Are you certain your books can withstand their scrutiny? Cameron let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He wrapped his free arm around Ashley's waist, pulling her closer. My books are absolutely flawless. Cameron lied without missing a single beat. We run a tight ship, we have negligible overhead, and our profit margins are astronomical. Summit Holdings would be incredibly foolish to walk away from a guaranteed return on investment. The lead acquisition director is personally meeting me here tonight to shake my hand and close the deal. The ink is practically already dry. Beside him, Patricia beamed with unearned pride. She leaned toward a wealthy-looking woman standing nearby. My son is a financial genius, Patricia whispered loudly. He is carrying the entire corporate world on his shoulders. We always knew he was destined to be a titan of industry. We sacrificed everything to make sure he reached the top. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost impressive. He was standing in a room full of seasoned financial predators, casually claiming his embezzled, gutted, and bankrupt company was a gold mine. He was spending money he did not have to impress people who did not care, all while his parents proudly applauded his impending felony convictions. It was time to pull the curtain down on their pathetic little theater. I stepped out from the shadows of the floral arrangement and walked directly into the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. When you carry genuine absolute power, people feel it before they even see you. The conversations near the entrance abruptly halted. Several high-level executives, who recognized me from previous brutal corporate takeovers, immediately stepped aside, dipping their heads in respectful acknowledgement. The sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns naturally parted, forming a clear, unobstructed path straight through the center of the ballroom. I walked with the slow, measured grace of an executioner. My emerald gown caught the light, shimmering like liquid glass with every step. The Cartier diamonds at my throat and ears shot brilliant fractures of light across the room. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my stilettos echoed against the marble floor, cutting through the soft jazz music like a metronome counting down to a disaster. Cameron was mid-sentence, still bragging about his imaginary profit margins, when the silence of the room finally reached him. He paused, his arrogant smile freezing on his face, as he noticed the investors he was speaking to were no longer looking at him. They were looking past his shoulder. Cameron turned his head slowly. His eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, his brain simply could not process the visual information it was receiving. He saw the sharp, haute couture gown. He saw the blinding diamonds. He saw the aura of total, undisputed dominance radiating from my posture. Then the realization violently crashed into his mind. The crystal tumbler slipped entirely from his grip. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud, splashing amber liquid and ice cubes across the toes of his expensive leather shoes. His jaw went completely slack, his face draining of all color until he looked like a wax mannequin. Behind him, Ashley let out a sharp, audible gasp, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. Her eyes darted wildly over my designer gown. her brain short-circuiting as she tried to reconcile the filthy vagrant she had mocked this morning with the breathtaking billionaire standing before her. Patricia and Richard practically tripped over themselves stepping back. My father's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. My mother dropped her wine glass entirely, letting it shatter against the base of the ice sculpture. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Cameron. I did not speak. I simply let the crushing weight of my presence suffocate them. The filing clerk they had ordered to clean the toilets, the estranged daughter they had repeatedly called a toxic failure, was currently holding their entire fraudulent existence in the palm of her diamond-draped hand. Ashley was the first to break the suffocating silence. Her eyes swept over my emerald silk gown, taking in the flawless tailoring and the undeniable authenticity of the vintage Cartier diamonds resting against my collarbone. Pure venomous jealousy contorted her features into an ugly, rigid mask. She looked down at her own gaudy sequined dress, suddenly realizing she looked like a cheap imitation standing next to a masterpiece. She gripped Cameron's tuxedo sleeve, her manicured nails digging into the dark fabric, and leaned close to my mother. She whispered frantically, her eyes darting toward me with absolute malice. Patricia did not need much convincing. She seized the opportunity to reassert the dominance she felt she had lost in the Vanguard lobby earlier that day. She stepped away from the ice sculpture and marched directly into my path, fueled by a toxic combination of cheap white wine and lifelong arrogance. She planted her feet firmly, adjusting her posture to project maximum authority. "Where exactly did you rent those clothes?" Gemma Patricia demanded. Her shrill voice sliced right through the elegant hum of the ballroom, causing several nearby executives to turn their heads in our direction. "Did you drain whatever pathetic savings you have left just to play dress-up for one single night? You are making an absolute spectacle of yourself, and I will not allow it." I remained perfectly still. I did not offer a defense. I did not flinch. I let her harsh words crash against my silent composure like waves against a concrete breakwater. My utter lack of reaction only infuriated her further. She took another aggressive step forward, pointing her finger at my chest. "Do not stand there and ignore me!" Patricia hissed, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "I know exactly what you are doing. You found out your brother was attending a high-level corporate function, and you snuck in here to hook some wealthy investor to pay off your debts. You think you can just waltz into an exclusive 5-star hotel looking for a sugar daddy to fund your failures. You are embarrassing your brother on the most important night of his entire career, and I refuse to let you ruin his monumental success." She spun around wildly, waving her hands in the air to grab the attention of the hotel staff stationed near the perimeter of the ballroom. "Security." Patricia screamed, her voice echoing off the high crystal chandeliers. "Security, get over here immediately. We have a trespasser who needs to be removed. Get this imposter out of here before she causes any more trouble." Cameron seemed to regain a fraction of his color at the sound of his mother taking charge. His initial terror was quickly replaced by a wave of arrogant relief. He straightened his posture, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and offered an apologetic smile to the venture capitalists standing behind him. He leaned in close to his potential investors, shaking his head with a look of manufactured pity. "I am so sorry, gentlemen," Cameron said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is my estranged sister. She has a history of severe mental instability and a desperate need for attention. It is a deeply tragic family situation, but I assure you it will be handled swiftly. Please excuse the interruption." The commotion had successfully drawn a rapid response. A team of 4 large security personnel in dark formal suits began moving swiftly across the ballroom floor. Leading the tactical formation was the general manager of the Waldorf Astoria. He was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair, known throughout the city for his ruthless efficiency in maintaining the absolute exclusivity of his high society events. Cameron stepped forward to meet him, puffing out his chest to project the image of a commanding corporate titan taking control of a messy situation. "Thank you for responding so quickly," Cameron said, flashing the manager a bright, artificial smile. "This woman is not on the guest list. She is an estranged relative causing a major disturbance and attempting to harass my potential business partners. I need her physically escorted off the property immediately. I do not care how much noise she makes, just get her out the back service door. The general manager did not slow his pace. He did not acknowledge Cameron's commanding tone. He did not even cast a single glance in Patricia's direction. He walked with total unwavering purpose, cutting straight through the tense crowd until he reached the exact spot where I was standing. Cameron crossed his arms, an expression of supreme victory settling over his features. Ashley smirked beside him, practically bouncing on her heels in anticipation of my impending public humiliation. They fully expected to watch me be dragged away in disgrace in front of the very billionaires they were desperately trying to impress. Instead, the general manager stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He brought his feet together, placed his hands respectfully at his sides, and executed a flawless 90-degree bow. The entire grand ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The jazz quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. "Good evening, Miss Gemma," the general manager said, his voice projecting absolute unwavering deference and profound respect. The sound carried effortlessly across the sudden dead silence of the room. "We are deeply honored by your presence tonight. Your private VIP table has been fully prepared exactly to your precise specifications. The executive chef is waiting for your personal approval on the tasting menu, and the Summit Holdings board members have requested the privilege of joining you for a pre-dinner toast whenever you are ready." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The reality of the situation crashed down upon my family with the devastating force of a falling building. Cameron's smug, victorious smile was wiped from his face so fast it looked as though he had been physically struck. His mouth fell open, a quiet, breathless sound escaping his throat as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible information. Ashley physically stumbled backward, her jaw dropping in utter sheer horror as she stared at the general manager bowing to the woman she had just called a thrift store vagrant. Patricia stood completely paralyzed. The manicured finger she had been using to point at me slowly lowered to her side, trembling uncontrollably. She looked at me, then at the bowing hotel manager, and then back to me, her eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. I did not gloat. I did not throw their insults back in their faces. I simply offered the general manager a small, polite nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "Please inform the Summit board members that I will join them momentarily. I just need to finish a very brief conversation with the Vanguard media representative." I turned my gaze back to Cameron, watching the absolute terror completely consume him. He was no longer looking at a filing clerk, he was looking at his executioner. Cameron could not maintain eye contact, his gaze fractured, darting wildly around the ballroom as his mind scrambled for an exit strategy. The sheer weight of my sudden authority had completely crushed the air from his lungs. He needed to reassert his dominance. He needed to prove to his wife and his parents that he was still the golden boy, the untouchable executive. Like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver, he fell back on his only instinct. He needed to spend money. "Let us get a drink!" Cameron choked out, his voice thin and raspy. He grabbed Ashley by the elbow and practically dragged her toward the long, glowing expanse of the mahogany bar at the far end of the ballroom. Patricia and Richard hurried after them, desperate to escape the sudden freezing temperature of my presence. I gave them a 30-second head start before I followed. My footsteps were silent on the plush carpet, but the crowd parted for me intuitively. I watched my brother lean heavily against the polished brass rail of the bar. He was sweating now. Tiny beads of moisture gathered at his hairline, glistening under the crystal chandeliers. Bartender Cameron barked, slamming his hand flat against the wood to demand immediate service. "Give me a bottle of your vintage Cristal, the 96 if you have it, and bring 5 glasses." He reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out his heavy metal corporate Vanguard Media credit card. He slapped it down on the bar counter with a loud, arrogant clack. He shot a quick, desperate glance back at his parents, as if the mere act of purchasing a $3,000 bottle of champagne would magically erase the humiliation they had just endured. "Put it on this," Cameron commanded. "Keep the tab open for the rest of the night." The bartender, An older man in a crisp white tuxedo jacket picked up the heavy card with practiced indifference. He swiped it through the sleek black terminal hidden behind the bar. I stopped a few feet away, standing just out of Cameron's peripheral vision. I watched the bartender's brow furrow. He tapped a few buttons on the screen and swiped the card a second time. A small red light blinked on the machine. "I am sorry, sir," the bartender said, his voice polite but firm. "This card has been declined." Cameron froze. The confident smirk he was trying to build instantly vanished. He snatched the card from the bartender's hand, staring at the embossed numbers as if the metal itself had betrayed him. "That is impossible!" Cameron snapped, his voice rising in panic. "Run it again. It is a platinum corporate account. There is no limit on that card. Run it manually." The bartender took the card back and typed the numbers directly into the keypad. The result was instantaneous. The machine beeped a sharp, flat tone of rejection. "Declined again, sir," the bartender said, pushing the card back across the mahogany surface. "The system is showing the account has been completely frozen by the issuing bank. Do you have another form of payment?" Ashley let out an exasperated sigh, crossing her arms and looking around to see if anyone was watching them. "Cameron, this is embarrassing," she hissed. "Just give him your personal card." Cameron's hands were actually shaking now. He dug into his wallet and pulled out a personal platinum credit card, sliding it across the bar. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He knew exactly what was happening, but his mind refused to accept the reality of the walls closing in around him. The bartender swiped the personal card. Another sharp beep. The red light blinked again. "I apologize, sir, but this account is also locked." The bartender stated, his tone dropping into the professional coolness reserved for troublesome guests. "I cannot serve you without a valid form of payment." "What is going on?" Richard demanded, stepping up beside his son. His face was flushed with secondary embarrassment. "Cameron, call your bank. This is a ridiculous error. Let me pay for it." Richard reached for his own wallet, but Cameron grabbed his wrist, stopping him. "No." Cameron growled, his eyes wide with a frantic, trapped energy. "I am paying for it. It is a security flag. I made a massive transfer earlier today, and it probably triggered a fraud alert. I just need to call my wealth manager." He was lying to his father right to his face, and the strain of holding up the facade was visibly cracking his foundation. He reached for his phone, but his fingers were trembling so badly he nearly dropped the device on the floor. I decided he had suffered enough in front of the bartender. It was time to intervene. I stepped smoothly up to the bar, sliding right into the space next to Cameron. The scent of his panic was overwhelming. Without a single word, I reached into my evening clutch and withdrew a solid titanium Centurion card. I placed it gently on the bar top, tapping it once with my index finger. "I will cover the vintage crystal for this gentleman," I said to the bartender, my voice perfectly calm and polite. In fact, put his entire family's tab on my account for the evening. They look like they could use a drink. The bartender nodded respectfully, immediately processing the heavy black card. The machine flashed a bright green light of approval in less than a second. Cameron stood paralyzed, staring at my black card as if it were a venomous snake. Ashley's jaw worked silently up and down, unable to form a coherent insult. Patricia looked like she was going to faint right there on the patterned carpet. I turned my body slightly, facing my brother. I leaned in close, invading his personal space. I kept my face angled away from our parents, ensuring this specific execution was meant for him alone. I lowered my voice to a soft, lethal whisper right next to his ear. "Are you wondering why the corporate card bounced, Cameron?" I whispered, my breath ghosting against his cheek. "Are you wondering why your personal accounts are suddenly locked out? It is not a security flag. It is an asset freeze." Cameron stopped breathing entirely. He stared straight ahead at the bottles lined up behind the bar, his eyes wide and unblinking. I smiled, a cold, terrifying curve of my lips. "Those 3 dummy consulting firms you set up?" I murmured, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Apex Synergy, Global Media Strategies, Horizon Dynamics. The $8 million you systematically funneled into those Cayman Island trusts over the past 3 years. I found it all this morning down in the basement, and I sent every single wire transfer log to the federal authorities, and the Summit Holdings audit team at noon. Your accounts were frozen by a federal judge exactly 2 hours ago. Cameron let out a tiny, broken wheeze. He gripped the edge of the mahogany bar so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He looked like a man standing on the gallows listening to the trapdoor lever being pulled. I reached out and gently straightened the lapel of his expensive Tom Ford tuxedo. I patted his chest right over his racing, terrified heart. "Drink your champagne, Cameron," I said, stepping back and raising my voice just enough for our parents to hear the final sentence. "Enjoy the party. And good luck with your $50 million presentation tomorrow morning. I hear the board of directors loves a good fairy tale." I did not wait to watch him collapse. I turned and walked away, the heavy silk of my gown sweeping across the floor, leaving my family standing frozen in the wreckage of their shattered empire. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vanguard Media's executive boardroom like a harsh interrogation light. The panoramic view of the Chicago skyline was spectacular, but nobody in the room was looking outside. The air inside the glass-walled enclosure was thick with the distinct metallic scent of corporate desperation and stale espresso. Vanguard Media was bleeding out. Despite the polished mahogany table and the Herman Miller leather chairs, the company was weeks away from insolvency. Everyone sitting around that table knew it. Marcus Thorne, the current chief executive officer of Vanguard, paced the length of the room like a caged animal. His tailored suit hung slightly loose on his frame, a physical testament to the sleepless nights he had endured trying to keep the sinking ship afloat. The only lifeline left in the turbulent water was Summit Holdings. The massive global conglomerate had signaled interest in a $50 million acquisition of Vanguard. It was a miracle. It was the golden parachute the board of directors had been praying for. Today was the day they would either secure the capital injection and survive, or begin drafting their bankruptcy declarations. Cameron pushed through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom at precisely 9:45. He looked like a man walking to his own execution who had somehow convinced himself he was going to a parade. He had spent the entire night locked in his home office frantically making unreturned phone calls to offshore bankers in the Cayman Islands. Every single account was frozen. The $8 million he had embezzled from Vanguard was locked down tight by a federal hold. The panic had nearly consumed him, but his towering narcissism had built a final desperate firewall in his mind. He had rationalized the disaster. He convinced himself that Gemma was nothing more than a vicious corporate spy who had somehow tipped off the authorities. But if he could just close this $50 million deal with Summit Holdings today, he would be named a hero by the Vanguard board. He could use his massive incoming bonus to hire the best defense attorneys in the country, tie the embezzlement to a scapegoat, and disappear before the federal indictments were unsealed. He adjusted his silk tie, gripping his leather portfolio so hard his knuckles ached. His eyes were bloodshot, and his skin carried a sickly gray pallor, but he forced his lips into a confident shark-like smile. Sitting in the very last row of the boardroom in the section explicitly reserved for minority shareholders were Patricia and Richard. They looked entirely out of place among the hardened corporate executives. Patricia was wearing her best conservative beige suit, clutching a designer handbag tightly to her chest. Richard sat stiffly beside her, his jaw set in a rigid line of forced confidence. Their presence was not a coincidence, and it certainly was not standard corporate protocol. 6 months ago, Cameron had convinced them that Vanguard Media was on the verge of becoming the next tech unicorn. He had promised them astronomical returns if they invested early. Blinded by their absolute faith in their golden child, Richard and Patricia had made the fatal mistake of going all in. They had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on their sprawling suburban estate. They had liquidated their entire retirement portfolio. They had drained every single savings account they possessed to purchase a block of Vanguard shares. If this $50 million buyout failed, they would lose the house they had lived in for 30 years. They would be completely destitute. The encounter with me at the Waldorf Astoria the previous night had shaken them to their core. Patricia had spent the car ride home hyperventilating while Richard stared blankly out the window. But morning brings a dangerous kind of denial. Over black coffee, they had rebuilt their delusions. They assured each other that my designer gown and diamond collar were probably rented. They reasoned that the black titanium credit card belonged to some wealthy older man I was using. They absolutely refused to believe that the daughter they had discarded could ever hold genuine power over their precious son. They were sitting in the boardroom today to watch Cameron secure the deal that would make them millionaires and prove me wrong once and for all. Marcus Thorne stopped pacing and checked his platinum Rolex. It was exactly 2 minutes to 10. He turned to Cameron, his voice tight with anxiety. "Are you entirely prepared for this?" Cameron, Marcus asked, wiping a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. "The Summit Holdings acquisition team is ruthless. They are going to tear through your financial projections like wolves. You told me the books were clean. You told me our profit margins justified the $50 million valuation. If you drop the ball on this presentation, we are all finished." Cameron smoothed the front of his jacket, puffing out his chest. "Do not worry about a thing, Marcus," he said, his voice laced with manufactured bravado. "I know this company inside and out. I have built a foolproof narrative. The Summit representatives are going to be eating out of the palm of my hand. Just sit back and let me close the biggest deal in Vanguard history." Richard leaned forward in his seat at the back of the room, shooting his son a proud, encouraging thumbs up. Patricia beamed, clasping her hands together in silent prayer. The heavy oak double doors at the front of the boardroom suddenly clicked open. The low murmur of anxious conversation around the mahogany table died instantly. Executives straightened their posture, pulling their legal pads closer. Marcus Thorne quickly buttoned his suit jacket, slapping on his best welcoming smile. Cameron stepped up to the front podium, resting his hands on the edges of the wood, projecting absolute control. The receptionist stepped into the room, her voice echoing clearly across the silent space. "Gentlemen," the receptionist announced, stepping aside to hold the door open. "The lead acquisition director from Summit Holdings has arrived." Every eye in the room turned toward the doorway, ready to greet the corporate savior who held their financial survival in their hands. Cameron stood tall, his heart hammering against his ribs, his fake smile stretched to its absolute limit, ready to deliver the performance of his life. The heavy oak doors did not just open, they were forcefully thrown wide. Two massive private security contractors in immaculate black suits stepped into the boardroom, moving with synchronized military precision. They immediately flanked the entrance, crossing their hands in front of them, scanning the terrified Vanguard executives with cold, clinical detachment. Then I walked into the room. I was no longer wearing the glittering emerald gown from the Waldorf Astoria, and I had permanently shed the pathetic, oversized sweater of the subservient sister. Today I wore a razor-sharp charcoal gray Tom Ford power suit cut with ruthless geometric precision. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot, and my heels clicked against the hardwood floor with the rhythmic finality of a ticking time bomb. I did not look at my mother sitting in the back row. I did not look at my father, whose jaw was practically resting on his chest. I did not even look at Cameron, who was standing at the presentation podium, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. I walked straight down the length of the massive mahogany table, ignoring the stunned silence of the Vanguard board members. I reached the head of the table, the single oversized leather chair explicitly reserved for the ultimate authority in the room. I pulled it out, sat down gracefully, and placed my black leather portfolio onto the polished wood. Cameron completely snapped, the remaining fragile threads of his sanity fractured under the sheer weight of his panic. He slammed his hand flat against the presentation podium, the loud crack echoing violently across the quiet room. "Are you entirely out of your mind?" Cameron screamed, his voice cracking with desperate rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "Security! Grab her right now! Get this psychotic vagrant out of my boardroom! Gemma, get out of that chair immediately! That seat is specifically reserved for the director of Summit Holdings. You are ruining everything." He looked wildly toward the two black-suited security guards standing by the door, fully expecting them to drag me away. The guards did not move a single muscle. They simply stared straight ahead, completely ignoring his frantic orders. In the back row, Patricia half stood from her chair, her hands fluttering nervously. "Cameron, what is going on?" she began, her voice trembling with mounting terror. "Silence," Marcus Thorne roared. The chief executive officer of Vanguard Media pushed himself up from his chair. Marcus was sweating profusely, his face pale and slick. He looked at Cameron with a mixture of absolute fury and sheer terror. He was a man who knew his company was dead, and he was looking directly at the executioner. "Shut your mouth right now, Cameron," Marcus ordered, his voice shaking with barely suppressed panic. "Sit down before you destroy whatever tiny fraction of goodwill we have left." Marcus turned away from my brother. He buttoned his suit jacket with trembling fingers, took a deep, steadying breath, and turned to address the confused, terrified board of directors. He bowed his head slightly in my direction, a gesture of total, absolute submission. "Gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice echoing clearly across the dead silence of the boardroom, "please allow me to formally introduce our highly anticipated guest. This is Ms. Gemma. She is the Senior Restructuring Specialist of Summit Holdings, and from this exact moment forward, she holds the absolute power of life and death over our entire company." The words dropped into the center of the room like a heavy anvil. The silence that followed was so profound it was suffocating. You could practically hear the individual heartbeats of the men sitting around the mahogany table. The psychological destruction of my family was instantaneous and absolute. In the minority shareholder section, Patricia let out a sharp, strangled gasp. The designer handbag she had been clutching like a lifeline slipped through her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy, definitive thud. The contents spilled across the carpet, but she did not even notice. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrified, dawning realization that the daughter she had abused and discarded had quietly become a billionaire corporate titan. All of her arrogant insults, all of her cruel dismissals rushed back to haunt her in a single crushing wave. Beside her, Richard began to breathe in short, ragged gasps. All the blustering, arrogant pride he had projected for his entire life completely evaporated. His face turned the color of wet ash. He slumped forward aggressively, clutching his chest with both hands, as if my new title had physically struck his heart. The realization that his retirement fund, his mortgaged estate, and his entire financial future were currently sitting in the palm of my hand paralyzed him. He had bet his entire life on Cameron, and he had just lost everything. But Cameron's collapse was the most spectacular. He staggered backward, physically recoiling from the podium as if it had suddenly caught fire. His brain completely short-circuited, unable to process the apocalyptic reality standing before him. The sister he had mocked, the woman he had tried to throw out of a hotel lobby, the person he thought he could effortlessly crush, was the Summit Holdings executive he had been begging for a bailout. The realization that I was the one auditing his fraudulent company hit him with the force of a speeding truck. His legs gave out completely. He took 2 clumsy, stumbling steps backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. He collapsed heavily into his leather chair, his arms dangling uselessly at his sides. He stared at me with wide, hollow eyes, the absolute certainty of his impending federal prison sentence crushing the last breath from his lungs. I leaned forward in the director's chair, steepling my fingers together, and let my cold gaze slowly sweep across the terrified Vanguard executives before finally locking onto my brother. "Let us begin," I said, my voice quiet, sharp, and carrying the unmistakable authority of a corporate predator. "Cameron, I believe you were just about to explain your absolutely flawless financial projections to the board. Please do not let me interrupt your presentation. We are all fascinated to hear exactly how you plan to cover the massive black hole sitting in your offshore accounts." Cameron tried to speak. Only a dry, clicking sound emerged from his throat. He clutched the sides of the podium so violently, his knuckles turned bone white, but his knees completely buckled. He slid down the polished wood paneling, collapsing into a heap on the floor, entirely out of sight from the executives seated around the table. Marcus Thorne covered his face with trembling hands, letting out a long, broken sigh. I did not grant my brother the mercy of a pause. I stood up and retrieved a small silver remote from my portfolio. Pressing a single button, I activated the boardroom's presentation system. The heavy electronic blackout shades descended over the glass walls, sealing us in cool artificial twilight. A massive digital display screen dropped silently from the ceiling directly behind the podium where Cameron was cowering. I clicked the remote, and the screen illuminated the terrified faces of the Vanguard board members with a blinding white light. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic family screaming match. This was a corporate execution conducted with surgical legal precision. I began cycling through the slides. First, we will examine the vendor accounts. I stated, my voice echoing flat and even across the quiet room. Over the last 24 months, Vanguard Media has funneled exactly $8.4 million to three primary consulting firms: Horizon Dynamics, Global Media Strategies, Apex Synergy. On your internal ledgers, these are listed as critical external marketing partners. In reality, they are phantom shell corporations registered to a single post office box in the Cayman Islands. I clicked to the next slide, displaying a complex web of wire transfers, cross-referenced with high-definition photographs from my sister-in-law Ashley's public social media accounts. The board members leaned forward, squinting at the screen in growing horror. While Vanguard was quietly missing payroll targets and defaulting on basic operational loans, these phantom funds were financing a life of extreme luxury, I explained, pointing the laser indicator at a specific transaction. $50,000 routed through Horizon Dynamics directly paid for a chartered yacht in Monaco last July. $80,000 cleaned through Apex Synergy purchased a Cartier diamond tennis bracelet. $200,000 covered the down payment on a vacation property in Aspen. Every single dime was stolen directly from Vanguard operating capital. In the minority shareholder seats at the back of the room, Patricia let out a muffled whimpering sound, pressing both hands over her mouth. She recognized those photographs. She had liked those pictures online, praising her daughter-in-law's fabulous success. Beside her, Richard looked like he was having a stroke. He sat perfectly rigid, staring at the screen as the graphic representation of his liquidated retirement funds, his second mortgage, and his entire life savings dissolved into fraudulent wire transfers and fake invoices. He was watching his golden boy rob him blind in real time. I advanced to a deeply complex spreadsheet detailing Vanguard's actual financial health. The panic around the mahogany table escalated into absolute terror. As you can clearly see, gentlemen, the financial reports Cameron submitted to Summit Holdings during our preliminary acquisition audit were entirely fabricated. I continued coldly. He inflated subscriber revenue by 400%. He hid massive toxic debts under temporary holding companies and forged signature authorizations from non-existent auditors. When you adjust the ledger to reflect the actual verified numbers, Vanguard Media does not have a $50 million valuation. Factoring in the stolen capital, the defaulted loans, and the pending vendor lawsuits, this company is operating at a severe terminal deficit. Vanguard has negative equity. You are completely bankrupt. Marcus Thorne looked up, his eyes wide and pleading. He looked like a drowning man grasping at air. "Is there any way to save it?" he asked, his voice cracking with desperation. "Can Summit still provide a bridge loan to keep the doors open?" I turned off the projector. The screen rolled back up into the ceiling and the blackout shades automatically rose, flooding the room with harsh morning sunlight. I walked slowly back to the head of the table, sitting down and placing my hands flat on the polished mahogany surface. I looked directly at Marcus and then let my gaze drop to the floor where Cameron was still slumped, paralyzed by fear. I announced the immediate cancellation of the $50 million funding package. I stated, my voice ringing with lethal finality. Summit Holdings will not be bailing out Vanguard Media. Instead, due to the extreme negative equity and the toxic debt profile, my firm will be executing a hostile takeover. Summit Holdings is acquiring Vanguard Media in its entirety for exactly $1. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal jacket. I looked down at my brother. "Cameron, you are stripped of all corporate titles, your shares are voided, and you are fired immediately. And this file containing every forged invoice and offshore routing number has been sent straight to the FBI." The absolute silence in the room stretched into a ringing vacuum. The weight of the federal investigation hung in the air like a guillotine. Marcus Thorne was the first executive to react. He did not look at Cameron. He did not look at the other board members. He looked directly at me. With a trembling hand, he pushed his heavy leather chair back and stood up. Summit Holdings will have the full, absolute cooperation of the existing executive board. Ms. Gemma Marcus stated, his voice devoid of any previous arrogance. He was speaking rapidly, desperate to save his own skin by throwing my brother directly to the wolves. We will surrender all internal communications, financial ledgers, and offshore routing data immediately. I will personally instruct the legal department to freeze all document shredding. We are entirely at your disposal. The rest of the board members followed suit. Grown men executives who had spent the last decade commanding entire industries were practically tripping over each other to distance themselves from the radioactive crater that Cameron had become. They averted their eyes, packing their leather briefcases with frantic, jerky movements, treating me with the terrified reverence reserved for a vengeful deity. From the back row, a sound pierced the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. It was a low, visceral wail. Patricia pushed past the chairs, ignoring her spilled designer handbag and the scattered contents rolling across the floor. She stumbled down the aisle toward the front of the room. "Cameron!" She cried out, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "Cameron! Tell her she is lying. Tell them it is a mistake. The money. Richard's retirement fund. The second mortgage on the estate. You promised us, Cameron. You promised we were going to be rich." Cameron did not even look at his mother. He could not. His eyes were completely glazed over, locked on the blank digital projector screen that had just broadcast his federal crimes to the entire room. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him in heavy, suffocating waves. The offshore accounts were frozen. The $50 million buyout was dead. The FBI had his forged signatures. There was no golden parachute. There was no brilliant escape plan. There was only the cold concrete floor of a federal penitentiary waiting for him. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence shattered into a million jagged pieces. The polished, untouchable corporate executive vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate little boy. He slid entirely out of his leather chair. His knees hit the carpet with a dull, heavy thud. He did not try to stand back up. Instead, he began to crawl. In his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, the exact suit he had worn to project absolute dominance and wealth. My brother shuffled on his hands and knees down the length of the mahogany table. He dragged himself past the polished wingtip shoes of his former colleagues, who stepped back in disgust. He crawled past his weeping mother and his paralyzed father. Richard remained completely frozen in the back row, a broken man watching his legacy dissolve into a pathetic puddle on the boardroom floor. Knowing he was going to lose his home, his country club membership, and his entire social standing by the end of the month, Cameron kept his head bowed, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps until he reached the head of the table. He stopped right at my feet. He looked up at me. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered agony. Tears streamed down his pale cheeks, ruining his perfectly styled hair, mixing with the cold sweat on his forehead. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the hem of my charcoal gray blazer. "I am sorry." Gemma Cameron sobbed, his voice a wet, pathetic choke. "I am so sorry. Please, please do not let them take me away. Do not call the police. I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. I will give it all back. Just tell them it was a corporate error. Tell Summit Holdings to drop the audit. You have the power to stop this. I will do anything you say, anything." He pressed his forehead against my shoes, openly weeping in front of the entire Vanguard executive board. Patricia let out a horrified gasp, covering her face with her hands, unable to witness the absolute degradation of her golden child. I looked down at the top of my brother's head. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no familial obligation. The well of my empathy had dried up years ago, drained by their endless systematic cruelty. I slowly reached down and pried his sweaty, trembling fingers off my blazer. I stood up, pushing my chair back. The rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed through the silent room as I walked toward the far corner of the boardroom. The overnight janitorial staff had left a heavy-duty yellow mop bucket and a wet string mop tucked discreetly behind a decorative potted ficus tree near the glass wall. I grabbed the metal handle of the bucket. With a swift, calculated kick, I sent the yellow plastic bucket sliding violently across the plush carpet. It glided across the room and slammed directly into Cameron's knees, splashing a small wave of soapy gray water onto his expensive trousers. I tossed the wooden handle of the mop. It clattered loudly onto the floor, stopping right next to his trembling hands. I walked back to the head of the table, looking down at him with absolute clinical detachment. "Good," I stated, my voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. "Yesterday you told me to clean the main lobby. You treated me like garbage under your expensive shoes. Today the only contract I can offer a fraudster waiting for his court date is janitorial work. Take it or I call the police right now." The room held its collective breath. Marcus Thorne stared in stunned silence. The two black-suited security guards by the door shifted their weight, crossing their arms tightly, waiting for my command. Cameron stared at the dirty string mop lying on the carpet. His chest heaved as he hyperventilated. He looked back at me, his eyes begging for a fraction of the mercy he had never once shown me. He found none in my expression. He looked at his father, seeking a rescue that was never going to come. Richard simply looked away, entirely hollowed out by his own financial ruin, unable to even meet his son's gaze. Slowly, agonizingly, my brother reached out his hand. His fingers hovered over the wooden handle. He let out a low, broken whimper of pure, ultimate defeat. His hand closed around the mop. He pulled it toward his chest, clutching the dirty bristles against his tailored tuxedo jacket. He knelt in the spilled, soapy water, bowing his head in total subjugation, and began to drag the wet mop across the carpet. The golden boy, the untouchable heir, the arrogant executive was gone forever. He was nothing but a broken man, cleaning the floor at my feet, while I watched him erase his own existence. Marcus Thorne swallowed hard. He recognized instantly that the corporate execution was concluded and the familial slaughter was about to commence. He quietly signaled the remaining board members. Like silent phantoms, they gathered their briefcases and slipped out the glass doors, leaving Vanguard Media in my complete control. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. Only my security team, my lead corporate attorney, my completely broken brother, and my hysterical parents remained. The click of the closing door seemed to break the paralyzing spell holding my mother in her seat. Patricia erupted from the back row. She scrambled over the dropped contents of her designer purse, practically sprinting down the aisle. Her face was a twisted mask of revulsion and panic. Richard was right behind her, his chest heaving, his face purple with a dangerous cocktail of high blood pressure and blind rage. "You are an absolute devil!" Patricia shrieked. Her voice cracked, echoing harshly off the glass walls. She pointed a trembling finger at my face, stepping over Cameron, who was still mechanically dragging the wet string mop across the carpet in a catatonic daze. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? You set a trap for your brother. You pushed him into a dead end just to satisfy your own sick, twisted jealousy." I remained seated in the director chair, resting my hands on the mahogany surface. I watched her rave with the mild curiosity of a scientist observing a predictable lab rat. Richard slammed his hands down on the table opposite me. He leaned forward aggressively, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me completely, forgetting that he was no longer the king of his castle. He was a beggar standing in my boardroom. "You are going to fix this right now, Gemma," Richard growled, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. It shook with raw desperation. "You have the power to stop that FBI file. You have the money. You are going to authorize that $50 million buyout, and you are going to save this family. We are going to lose everything because of your vindictive games." "Because of me?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. My voice was dangerously quiet. "I did not force Cameron to set up offshore shell companies. I did not forge the financial audits. I simply read the ledger you were all too blind to verify." "We mortgaged the estate for him!" Patricia wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. We took out a massive second loan against the house. We liquidated our retirement portfolios. We put every single penny we had into Vanguard shares because Cameron told us the Summit buyout would make us billionaires. If this company goes bankrupt, the bank will seize the house. We will be homeless, Gemma. You have all this money. You work for Summit. You must pay off your brother's debt and save your family. I let her words hang in the air. The sheer breathtaking entitlement was almost a work of art. They had spent decades treating me like dirt on their shoes. They had cheered when Cameron publicly humiliated me. They had demanded I pay for their vintage champagne while they mocked my existence. And now, standing in the wreckage of their own greed, their immediate instinct was to demand that I sacrifice myself to save them. Save my family? I repeated slowly, tasting the words. That is a fascinating concept. Tell me, Patricia, where was this profound sense of family duty when you threw me out of the house with absolutely nothing? Where was this unbreakable bond when Richard told me I was a worthless disappointment who would never amount to anything? You did not mortgage your home out of love. You mortgaged it out of greed. You wanted the massive payout Cameron promised you. You placed your bets on your golden boy, and your golden boy turned out to be a common thief. You shut your mouth, Richard bellowed, his face contorting with rage. You owe us. We brought you into this world. We gave you everything. You are going to sign that bailout, or I swear I will drag your name through the mud. I will tell the press exactly what kind of monster you are. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression that made Richard instantly take a step back. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply raised my right hand and gestured to the corner of the room. My lead corporate attorney, a sharp-featured man named Vance, who had been standing silently near the security guards, stepped forward. He carried a thick leather binder. He walked to the head of the table and placed the binder directly in front of Richard and Patricia. He flipped it open, revealing pages of dense legal text and highlighted financial spreadsheets. What is this? Richard demanded, staring at the paperwork. You have been shouting about the bank foreclosing on your estate, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. You have been screaming about how the lender is going to seize your 30-year legacy because Vanguard shares are now officially worthless. But you made one fundamental miscalculation regarding how modern corporate finance operates. Patricia stared at the documents, her eyes darting across the pages. Her breathing hitched. When a regional bank holds a toxic high-risk secondary mortgage that is tied to volatile tech stock, they rarely keep that debt on their own books, I explained, using my most patient educational tone. They bundle those risky debts and sell them to massive conglomerate portfolios to mitigate their own risk. Your bank sold your specific debt portfolio 3 weeks ago. Richard froze. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He looked from the documents to my attorney, and then finally back to me. Did you forget who buys up high-risk distressed debt portfolios in this sector? I asked softly. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my father, ensuring he absorbed the absolute reality of his destruction. Summit Holdings bought your debt, Richard. To be strictly accurate, the specific restructuring division that I personally control bought your debt. I am your direct creditor. The bank is not going to take your house. I am going to take your house. Patricia let out a high, piercing scream that shattered the silence of the room. She staggered backward, clutching her chest, her knees giving out entirely. She collapsed into one of the leather boardroom chairs, weeping hysterically, rocking back and forth as the absolute finality of her ruin set in. Richard tried to speak, but his jaw simply worked silently up and down. He looked at his hands trembling uncontrollably against the mahogany wood. He looked at his son, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping into a dirty mop, completely broken and stripped of his dignity. And then he looked at me, the daughter he had thrown away, who now held the deed to his entire life. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the property, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute ruthless finality. Do not attempt to take the artwork or the fixtures. They belong to Summit Holdings now. My security team will escort you off the premises. The 2 security guards stepped forward, instantly moving to flank my parents. Richard recoiled, his hands shooting up defensively as if the physical proximity of the guards was an electric shock. Patricia let out a breathless, panicked sound, scrambling backward on the carpet until her back hit the mahogany paneling of the boardroom wall. "Wait!" Richard choked out, his voice completely stripped of its usual booming authority. "Gemma, please. You cannot just throw us out into the street. We are your parents. We gave you life. You cannot leave your mother homeless. Look at her." I raised a single hand. The security guards halted immediately, standing like stone statues. I stepped away from the head of the table, closing the distance between us. My high heels sank silently into the plush carpet, but every eye in the room tracked my movement. I stopped just a few feet away from where my parents were cowering. I looked at Patricia. Her designer mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and stained from where she had collapsed onto the floor. I looked at Richard. The man who had spent 30 years criticizing my clothes, my career, and my intelligence was now sweating profusely, his hands trembling so violently he had to press them against his thighs to hide the shaking. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "I will not foreclose on your house," I stated, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the heavy tension in the room. The reaction was instantaneous. Patricia let out a loud, gasping sob of pure relief. She pressed her hands to her chest, her eyes widening with desperate gratitude. Richard actually slumped forward, letting out a long breath that sounded like a deflating tire. He reached up and wiped the sweat from his forehead, a small, triumphant smirk threatening to break through his panic. He thought he had won. He genuinely believed that the invisible, unbreakable bond of familial obligation had just saved his pride. "Oh, Gemma!" Patricia cried out, stepping forward and reaching for my arm. "I knew it. I knew you could not be that cruel. I knew you still loved us. We will make this right. We will pay you back over time. We are a family, and families forgive each other." I stepped back out of her reach. Her hands grasped empty air. I did not say I was forgiving the debt. I corrected my tone, dropping to a glacial whisper. I said I am not taking the physical house. Richard froze, his hand pausing near his collar. "What does that mean?" he demanded, the panic instantly returning to his eyes. I signaled Vance. My attorney flipped to the next page of the thick leather binder, tapping his expensive pen against a new spreadsheet. "It means that Summit Holdings will execute a total aggressive seizure of your liquid assets." Instead, I explained, watching the color drain entirely from their faces. "We are seizing your complete retirement portfolios. We are draining your mutual funds, your offshore savings accounts, and the emergency trust funds you explicitly set up to protect Cameron. We are taking the vintage cars and the yacht club memberships. I am liquidating everything you own that holds immediate cash value to satisfy the margins of the toxic debt you signed over to my firm." Patricia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. "You get to keep the empty house," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute cold finality. "You get to keep the walls and the roof. But you will not have a single solitary dime left to your name. You will have no money to pay the exorbitant property taxes. You will have no capital to pay for the landscaping, the utility bills, or the household staff. You are going to be trapped inside a massive crumbling mansion with zero income and zero savings, watching the walls rot around you." "You cannot do this," Richard bellowed, taking a step forward, his fists clenched. "It is illegal. It is theft. You are ruining our lives. How will we survive? How will your mother show her face at the club?" "It is completely legal," I shot back, my voice finally rising, matching his anger with cold corporate precision. "You signed the secondary mortgage documents. You put your assets up as collateral to fund Cameron's fraudulent empire. You bet everything you had on your golden boy. You chose him. You invested your entire future into his absolute brilliance." I pointed down at Cameron. My brother was still kneeling on the floor, clutching the wet mop, staring blankly at the wall. The realization that his parents were now completely destitute had just hit him. It meant there was no money left for a high-powered criminal defense attorney. It meant there was no one left to bail him out. He was completely and utterly alone. "Now you get to enjoy the fruits of your investment," I said, looking from my father to my mother. You wanted Cameron to be the king of this family. You sacrificed my mental health, my education, and my dignity to build a throne for him. So go ahead. Pick him up off the floor. Take your brilliant, successful son back to your massive, empty house. You can all sit in the dark together when the power company cuts off the electricity and talk about how much better he is than me. Patricia fell to her knees, weeping openly, burying her face in her hands. The reality that her high society friends would abandon her, that she would become a social outcast, crushed her completely. Richard staggered backward, hitting the edge of the conference table, sliding down until he was sitting heavily in one of the chairs, staring blankly at his own hands. The absolute devastation was complete. I had not just defeated them, I had completely dismantled the toxic hierarchy that had defined our family for 3 decades. For the first time in my life, I felt no guilt. I felt no desperate urge to fix their problems. The heavy, suffocating weight of seeking their approval, of trying to be seen, of begging for a fraction of the love they blindly showered on my brother, completely vanished. My chest felt light. My mind was perfectly clear. Vance handed them the final liquidation notices. I instructed, turning away from the wreckage of my family. Security ensure they leave the building within the next 5 minutes. If they attempt to take any Vanguard property, including company laptops or phones, have them arrested for corporate theft. Understood, Ms. Gemma. The lead security guard replied, stepping forward to physically block Richard from moving toward me. I picked up my black leather portfolio from the table. I did not look back at Patricia crying on the floor. I did not look at Richard staring into the void. I did not look at Cameron clutching a janitor mop in a bespoke suit. They were no longer my family. They were simply bad investments that I had successfully liquidated. I walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, stepping into the bright, sunlit corridor to begin the rest of my life. The polished marble of the Vanguard media lobby stretched out below me, a monument to the fraudulent empire my father and brother had built. I stood on the glass balcony of the mezzanine level, leaning against the railing, watching the final act of this tragedy unfold. I had ordered security to escort them out, and I wanted a front-row seat to their expulsion. The silver doors of the executive elevator slid open with a soft chime. 2 massive Summit Holdings security guards stepped out first, clearing the path. Then came Cameron. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck only to be dragged ashore and beaten. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was stained with dirty mop water. His silk tie was askew, hanging loosely around his neck. His face was a bloated, blotchy mess of tears and terror. He stumbled forward, his polished shoes scuffing awkwardly against the pristine marble floor he had once proudly claimed to own. Standing in the center of the grand lobby, completely oblivious to the impending disaster, was his wife. Ashley looked like a walking advertisement for stolen wealth. She wore a pristine white Chanel pantsuit, holding a rare Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag that likely cost more than the average employee made in 5 years. Her blonde hair was perfectly blown out, and large designer sunglasses rested on top of her head. She was tapping her stiletto heel, impatiently checking her diamond-encrusted Rolex. She was waiting for Cameron to deliver the news of the $50 million Summit buyout, so she could immediately embark on a celebratory shopping spree in Milan. When she saw Cameron stumbling out of the elevator, her perfectly glossed lips parted in annoyance. "Cameron? What on earth is wrong with you?" Ashley snapped, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous lobby. "You look like a homeless person. Did you get the buyout signed or not? My personal shopper at Bergdorf is holding 3 bags for me, and I do not have all day." Cameron practically threw himself across the lobby. He fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around Ashley's legs, burying his wet face in her pristine white designer trousers. Ashley shrieked in disgust, physically recoiling and trying to push him away to protect the expensive fabric. "It is gone. Ash." Cameron wailed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, a pathetic guttural sound that made passing employees stop and stare. "Everything is gone. Vanguard is dead. Gemma took the company. She took the house. She took Mom and Dad's money. The FBI has the offshore files, Ash. They are coming for me. I am going to prison." Ashley stopped struggling. The words hit her like a bucket of ice water. Her hands hovered in the air, her manicured fingers stiffening as her brain rapidly processed the catastrophic financial implications of what her husband was sobbing into her knees. "What do you mean Gemma took the company?" Ashley demanded, her voice dropping to a sharp, lethal whisper. "What do you mean the FBI is coming?" "It was a fraud," Cameron choked out, barely able to breathe. "The vendor accounts were fake. Gemma knew. She set us up. We have nothing left. We are completely bankrupt. Please, Ash, you have to stand by me. We will hire a lawyer. We will fight this. I need you." I watched from the mezzanine as the illusion of their perfect high society marriage completely evaporated. Ashley did not look at him with sympathy. She did not offer a comforting hand or a whisper of reassurance. She looked down at him with the cold, calculating disgust of a woman examining a dead rat on her driveway. Ashley had not married a man. She had married a bank account, and the bank account had just announced it was permanently closed. "Get off me," Ashley hissed, kicking her leg back so forcefully that Cameron lost his balance and fell backward onto the marble floor. She brushed the front of her trousers, checking for stains, before glaring down at the pathetic, weeping mess of a man she had vowed to love in sickness and in health. The pragmatic survival instincts of a gold digger kicked in with terrifying speed. She realized instantly that standing next to him when the federal agents arrived would freeze her own assets and drag her down into the mud. "You absolute pathetic loser," Ashley sneered, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You promised me we were untouchable. You promised me the Vanguard money was completely clean. I am not going to federal prison because you are too stupid to hide a paper trail from your vagrant sister." "Ash, please," Cameron begged, crawling forward, reaching for her shoes. "I love you." "I love my freedom," Ashley snapped, stepping back out of his reach. She reached down to her left hand. With a swift, violent motion, she yanked the massive 5-carat diamond wedding ring off her finger. It was the ring Vanguard money had paid for, the ring he had bought by defrauding his own employees. She threw it directly at his face. The heavy platinum band struck his cheekbone, leaving a red mark before clattering loudly against the marble floor. It spun in a tight circle before coming to rest near his trembling hands. "I am filing for divorce this afternoon," Ashley announced, her voice echoing clearly for the entire lobby to hear. "Do not ever contact me again." She turned on her heel and marched toward the revolving glass doors at the front of the building. But she was not leaving alone. From the luxury waiting area near the entrance, a tall, athletic man in a fitted designer suit stood up. He had the rugged, tanned look of a professional tennis coach or a high-end personal trainer. He had been sitting there the entire time waiting. Ashley walked straight up to him, wrapping her arm around his waist and leaning into his chest. Cameron let out a strangled gasp. He stared at the man, his mind fracturing under this final, ultimate betrayal. He recognized him. It was their private yacht instructor from their country club. "Take me to the airport," Marcus Ashley said loudly, entirely ignoring her husband's horrified stare. "We are going to St. Bart's. I need a vacation from this absolute disaster." The man smirked, shooting Cameron a mocking, pitying look over his shoulder before escorting Ashley out through the glass doors. They stepped into a waiting black town car, leaving Cameron completely alone in the center of the vast, empty lobby. The absolute silence of the room was broken only by the sound of my brother screaming. It was a raw, animalistic sound of pure despair. He pounded his fists against the hard marble floor, shattering the skin on his knuckles. He screamed until his vocal cords tore, weeping uncontrollably, thrashing on the ground like a dying fish. He had lost his company, his parents' wealth, his freedom, his wife, and his dignity, all within the span of 30 minutes. I stood on the glass balcony looking down at him. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The universe had simply balanced its scales. I turned my back on his screams and walked away. 2 months passed with the ruthless efficiency of a perfectly executed hostile takeover. The spectacular implosion of the Vanguard media empire dominated the financial news cycles for weeks. But for me, it was simply another closed file on my pristine desk. The federal courts moved surprisingly fast when presented with an airtight paper trail of corporate fraud. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse on a rainy Tuesday morning watching the final legal nail being driven into my brother's coffin. Cameron stood before the judge looking like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. He wore a cheap off-the-rack suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. The custom Italian tailoring, the arrogant swagger, and the sneering superiority were entirely gone. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, unable to look at the gallery. The judge delivered the sentence with clinical precision. 3 years of suspended prison time and 2,000 hours of mandatory physical community service. He avoided a federal penitentiary only because he had completely cooperated and surrendered every single asset he had ever claimed to own. He was ordered to serve his community hours at a municipal waste management facility. The golden boy of the family who used to mock the working class would now spend the next several years wearing a bright orange high-visibility vest, picking up trash along the interstates, and scrubbing foul-smelling graffiti off concrete underpasses. If Cameron's punishment was a physical breaking, Richard and Patricia suffered a complete and total social execution. The bank foreclosures and the aggressive asset seizures by Summit Holdings left them with absolutely nothing. The massive iron gates of their heavily mortgaged estate were chained shut. I personally authorized the estate sale and ensured it was properly advertised. It was a viciously public spectacle. Their high society friends, the same people who used to drink their vintage wine, eat their expensive caviar, and laugh at their elitist jokes, showed up to buy their antique furniture, their crystal chandeliers, and Patricia's designer jewelry for pennies on the dollar. The vultures picked the carcass of their fake wealth entirely clean. With their bank accounts frozen and their credit completely obliterated, my parents were violently forced out of their insulated, luxurious bubble. They had to relocate to a dilapidated rental apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. The building was a decaying brick structure with peeling paint, flickering fluorescent hallway lights, and a broken intercom system that always buzzed with static. The air in the hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. It was the exact type of neighborhood Richard used to order his driver to speed through without even looking out the tinted windows. Now it was their permanent, inescapable reality. Vance, my lead attorney, provided me with weekly updates purely for legal compliance. The reports painted a pathetic and vivid picture of their new existence. Richard, the man who once commanded boardrooms with a booming voice and a titanium fist, was now spending his days arguing with apathetic building superintendents over leaking radiators and broken water heaters. He had desperately tried to secure a consulting job, reaching out to his old network. But his name was radioactive. The industry had completely blacklisted him. He was reduced to sitting at a scratched Formica kitchen table, calculating exactly how far their severely depleted pension could stretch to cover generic groceries and public transportation passes. Patricia had completely unraveled under the crushing weight of her new poverty. Without her country club lunches, her weekly spa appointments, her personal estheticians, and her army of subservient household staff, she aged 10 years in 2 short months. The woman who once threw a hysterical fit because a maid used the wrong brand of silver polish on a serving tray was now forced to drag her own laundry down 3 flights of dark stairs to a coin-operated basement laundromat. The crippling shame kept her locked inside that cramped 2-room apartment. She refused to go out into the daylight, terrified that she might run into someone she used to know. The grand high society facade they had systematically murdered my self-esteem to maintain was completely pulverized into fine dust. I did not feel a single ounce of residual anger as I read those legal reports. The burning need for their validation, the desperate childhood wish to finally be seen as a worthy daughter, had vanished the moment I walked out of that Vanguard lobby. They were strangers to me now. Strangers dealing with the entirely predictable consequences of their own monstrous, unapologetic greed. My life moved rapidly in the opposite direction. I was officially appointed the youngest managing director in the history of Summit Holdings. My new corner office was on the top floor of the city's highest skyscraper, overlooking a sprawling metropolis that I now helped shape. My days were filled with aggressive acquisitions, high-stakes negotiations, and building a financial portfolio that commanded absolute respect across the global market. I surrounded myself with a team of brilliant people who valued competence over bloodlines and strict loyalty over deceit. Late one Friday evening, my executive assistant brought in the final batch of paperwork regarding the Vanguard liquidation. She placed a small, crumpled manila envelope on top of the sleek black folders. It had been forwarded from my old apartment building. I sliced it open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a handwritten letter from Patricia. The cheap lined notebook paper was stained with what looked like dried tears, and the handwriting was shaky, frantic, and desperate. She begged for forgiveness. She wrote extensively about how freezing cold the apartment was at night. She pleaded for a small monthly financial allowance just to help them buy proper groceries and pay for Richard's expensive blood pressure medication. She ended the letter by frantically reminding me that blood is always thicker than water. I read the letter once from top to bottom. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt or pity. I vividly remembered standing in their grand custom kitchen at 18 years old, begging for help with my basic college tuition and being coldly told I was a worthless investment. I remembered being thrown out into the freezing street with nothing but a black garbage bag full of clothes. Blood might be thicker than water, but accountability was entirely unforgiving. I walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder in the corner of my office. I fed the desperate letter into the machine, listening to the satisfying mechanical hum as her pleas were sliced into 100 meaningless tiny strips of paper. I dropped the empty manila envelope into the recycling bin without a second thought. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass window, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. The city lights glittered below me, resembling a vast glowing grid of endless opportunities. The old toxic hierarchy was dead and buried. The heavy rusty chains of my past were permanently broken. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the crisp air of absolute financial and emotional freedom. I had not just survived their calculated cruelty, I had weaponized it, conquered their fraudulent empire, and built my own indestructible throne. I smiled, watching my reflection in the dark glass. The sweet taste of total victory would never fade. I turned away from my reflection in the dark glass, allowing the heavy silence of the executive suite to wash over me. The storm that had been threatening Chicago all morning finally broke. Thick sheets of cold rain began lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my 60th floor office. The sprawling metropolis below was swallowed by a sea of gray clouds and urban gloom. But inside my sanctuary, the temperature was perfectly regulated. The lighting was soft, and the atmosphere was one of absolute, untouchable tranquility. I walked over to the sleek Italian espresso machine resting on the polished marble credenza near my desk. The quiet mechanical hum of the machine grinding the dark roasted beans was a soothing rhythm. I placed a delicate porcelain cup beneath the spout, watching the rich, dark liquid stream down, filling the room with an intense, bitter aroma. I took a moment to appreciate the simple perfection of this daily ritual. For years, my mornings had been dictated by the chaotic demands of a family that actively despised me. I used to wake up with a knot of anxiety in my chest, wondering what new humiliation Cameron would invent, or what impossible standard Patricia would suddenly expect me to meet. Now my time belonged entirely to me. I took the hot espresso and held it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into my palms. I was the managing director of Summit Holdings. I controlled billions in global assets. I commanded a legion of the sharpest financial minds in the country. And I did it all without ever needing to raise my voice or throw a temper tantrum. Richard had spent his entire life believing that true power meant screaming at subordinates and terrifying his children. He was fundamentally wrong. True power was silent. True power was a signature on a piece of paper that could legally dismantle an entire empire before lunch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the espresso. The bitter taste grounded me in the present moment. My mind briefly flickered back to the shredded remains of Patricia's letter sitting in my wastebasket. It was fascinating how quickly the mighty could fall when stripped of their unearned advantages. 2 months ago, they were hosting lavish galas, pouring vintage champagne, and dictating the social hierarchy of the city elite. Today, They were nobodies. They were just two broke elderly people shivering in a drafty apartment, relying on public transit, and counting pennies at the local discount grocery store. I felt no obligation to rescue them. Society conditions us to believe that blood is a sacred contract. The world tells you that you must unconditionally forgive the people who share your genetics, regardless of how deeply they destroy your soul or sabotage your future. I completely rejected that narrative. They had forged a weapon out of the word family and used it to bleed me dry for decades. By walking away, I had simply disarmed them. The profound silence in my life right now was not emptiness. It was the absence of their toxicity. It was the sound of my own uncompromised freedom. Holding my cup, I walked slowly back to the massive glass window. The rain was falling harder now, driven by sharp gusts of wind whipping through the concrete canyons of the financial district. I looked down at the massive public plaza directly across the street from the Summit Holdings Tower. From 60 stories up, the people scurrying across the wet pavement looked like insignificant ants fleeing a sudden flood. They were huddled under black umbrellas fighting the bitter cold, pulling their coat collars tight against the relentless drizzle. My eyes drifted toward the edge of the plaza, near the heavily trafficked intersection. A municipal maintenance truck was parked near the curb, its yellow hazard lights blinking rhythmically, cutting through the gray fog. A small crew of municipal workers was scattered across the concrete, performing their mandatory community service. They were wearing heavy, high-visibility orange reflective vests over cheap gray hoodies. They carried long metal brooms and trash grabbers, dragging thick black plastic garbage bags behind them. Even from this extraordinary height, the neon orange vests stood out vividly against the bleak, dreary backdrop of the wet city. I focused my attention on one specific figure working near the edge of the large stone fountain. The man was moving sluggishly, his shoulders hunched against the biting cold, his head bowed low to avoid the stinging rain. He awkwardly stabbed at a soggy, discarded coffee cup, completely missing it on the first two attempts, before finally bending down to pick it up with his bare hands. He looked miserable. He looked utterly defeated. I stepped closer to the glass, resting my forehead against the cool pane. I knew exactly who it was. I did not need to see his face to recognize the pathetic slump of those shoulders. It was Cameron, the former golden boy of Vanguard Media, the heir apparent, who used to wear $10,000 suits and laugh at my existence, was now completely soaked in freezing rain, picking up wet garbage from the city streets. He was serving his 2,000 hours of mandatory labor directly in the shadow of the skyscraper where I currently ruled. I took another slow sip of my hot espresso, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue. The poetic justice of the universe was absolute perfection. I watched him drag his heavy trash bag across the wet concrete, shivering in the brutal wind. I felt no pity for him. I felt no lingering anger. I simply felt done. The diaper bag that day could not hold me back, and the label of family could no longer bind me. Sometimes the best forgiveness is not saving them, but letting them live with the price of their choices. As for me, I choose freedom. The compelling framework of the Sweet Revenge family drama highlights a profound and universally relatable lesson. True vindication does not come from begging for respect, but from quietly building your own undeniable independence. In these toxic dynamics, the protagonist is frequently cast as the family's scapegoat, perpetually overshadowed by a favored golden child. For years, she falls into the trap of seeking validation from parents and siblings who are deeply committed to misunderstanding her. They weaponize the concept of family to diminish her worth, keeping her trapped in a cycle of emotional reliance and constant disappointment. However, the turning point in these narratives teaches us that we cannot control the false identities others construct for us, but we can absolutely control our response to them. The protagonist's ultimate triumph is never born from a sudden emotional argument. Rather, it is the result of years of silent strategic perseverance. By stepping away from the toxic environment and secretly cultivating her own secret weapon, whether that is a thriving business, financial autonomy, or unshakable self-esteem, she strips her abusers of their power over her. The most satisfying aspect of this journey is not just the dramatic climax where her success is revealed, but her profound realization that she no longer needs their approval to validate her existence. She learns that the best way to handle people who belittle your worth is to outgrow them entirely. It is a powerful reminder that when an unhealthy environment refuses to give you a seat at the table, your best move is to walk away and build a better one. If you have ever felt undervalued by those who should support you the most, share your own story of reclaiming your power and independence in the comments below.